welcome to everybody to our very first, and I think hopefully not the last, but or definitely not going to be the last, I think, with the importance of the conversation, but to our first conversation around climate change and financial regulation and supervision. On the line with us today, we only have financial regulators and supervisors. So this gives us a nice space to really brainstorm, talk, discuss, and share. My name is Sarah Corley. I'm a Divisional Director at Digital Frontiers Institute, and one of my responsibilities is running events such as these. I'm also joined by my two colleagues, Nolwazi Khlope, and also we've got Septule on the line with us as well, who have been instrumental too on putting the seminars together. You will see more of Nolwazi and Septule over the next few days. They are each going to moderate the calls that are coming up tomorrow and the day after. But today is the first of our live discussion calls, and I have the pleasure of moderating. To give you all a quick background for those of you that are not quite sure about how all these live calls fit together, today's call we're focusing very much on green finance and the implications on financial regulation and supervision. Tomorrow's live call focuses on the nexus between inclusive green finance and gender inclusion. And then day 3, which is Thursday, that call looks at sustainable finance disclosure on data collection for central banks. So we hope that each day will kind of build on, from day to day, build on the knowledge, but also, add and diversify that knowledge. So we are going to record today's call, and we will be sharing that recording with everyone signed up. So if you do have a colleague or a peer or a friend who misses today's live call, don't worry, we will have a recording and a summary available for those who miss, and that will happen across all 3 days. So we'll make sure there's plenty of opportunity for you to catch up on any of the recordings and discussions that you might miss out on. I also really want to encourage you to log on to campus for those of you that have not. So you signed up through our campus process. There are more materials and more opportunities for discussion there, and networking and sharing and learning. A couple of housekeeping things for today's session. So we encourage you to stay on mute, just so we have less background distraction from the conversation and we can all hear each other clearly. But we do really, really want your engagement. So for those of you that can switch on your cameras, feel free. We'd love to see who we're engaging with. We also want to take your questions. So it would be wonderful if you can type your questions in the chat for us so that we can, I can come to you and get you to ask those questions live, but it helps with the flow of our conversation if I know what your question's going to be. And we want today's session to be engaging. It's not designed to be a webinar with just guest lecturers speaking at you. It's designed to be something interactive and engaging that we can all contribute to. So we look forward to lots of your, and sharing your thoughts too, right? I mean, this is a relatively new emerging topic and theme area. There's not a lot of people that have, we can learn from because they've done everything right. We're all in this together. So I think it's going to be really important to hear your views and thoughts on what's happening in your countries. The wonderful thing, we've already seen how many countries are already online on this call from globally, and it would be wonderful to hear best practices or examples, or even to discuss some of the challenges that you're facing in your individual countries as we go through today's call. So let me move on and really try not to spend too much more time talking, because actually let's get stuck into the conversation. So today's session, we are going to be talking about green finance implications on financial regulation supervision. And I'm delighted that I've been joined today by 2 guest speakers. We have Anatol and we have Nick with us on the line, who are experienced between them. I'm not going to say how many years of experience they have in financial regulation and supervision, because I'm sure that will give too many of their personal secrets away, but I can assure you that they've got an awful lot to contribute today. So rather than me introducing them, I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourself briefly. So Anatol, alphabetically with an A, I'll come to you first.
Thank you, Sarah, and greetings. Look forward to the exchange of discussions. So I'm Anatol Monid. I'm a senior director at the Toronto Centre, which is a capacity building organization for supervisors and regulators. And I've been with the Toronto Centre for 2 years. Prior to that, I was a supervisor in the financial services. I came to that role with an extensive insurance industry background, but did do all other sectors but securities in our regulation, and primarily in the market conduct, but I cut my teeth on prudential regulation. So hopefully I can contribute to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anatol. And Nick?
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Lovely to be here with you all. Thanks for inviting us to be part of this conversation. I'm Nick. I'm the head of global strategy and partnerships at an entity called AIR, the Alliance for Innovative Regulation. AIR is a non-profit leveraging digital modernization to help regulators build a financial system that serves everyone and produces widespread financial health. My former role up until about 18 months ago was as the Director of Innovation at the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, and I led the FCA's FinTech, RegTech and supervisory technology programs for a number of years, including things like its regulatory and digital sandboxes, its tech sprints, but also its internal digital and data transformation and data science programs. So yeah, delighted to be here. Looking forward to the discussion with you all. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. And I'm really delighted to have both of you on the call with me today, sharing your experience and knowledge, but I think also asking our audience some questions and challenges that we can all get into and have a great discussion together. So let me start. And I think a good place to start really is to make sure that we're all on kind of the same page, and these terms, and there's things out there that, we are beginning to learn, around green finance. And, one of the key things is that we're able to speak the same language and, understand what the topical issues are. And that helps us be able to have a conversation, and get the conversation going. So for some, the words will mean different things to others. So Anatol, I'd like to start with you. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about the network for greening the financial system, the NGFS, and maybe you can sort of start from there and tell us also a little bit more about what is green. When we say green finance, what are we talking about, and what learnings can central banks start to gain?
Okay, Sarah. So I think at its simplest form, green finance is any structured financial activity or a product and service that has been created to have a better environmental outcome. From a financial services side, it's loans, debt mechanisms, investments that are used to encourage the development of green projects or minimize the impact of climate, or more or simpler projects, but it can also be a combination of the two. So green finance is something that is blossoming around the world. The estimate is that that market in 2022 will be over $2 trillion. So there is a lot of money in the pocket of those people who are participating, and so many of those are financial institutions, and this brings us to the need for good supervision and regulation around greening. And so one of the organizations, as you've mentioned, is the Network for Greening Financial Systems, the NGFS. And we also have to think about the impact of what this money is trying to overcome. And the World Bank says that by 2030, extreme climate change will have displaced or pushed over 130 million people into extreme poverty. So anything we can do to address climate change will have a direct impact on a significant proportion of our world's population. And these are people who are already in disadvantaged conditions. They face the prospect of war, of displacement, and coming out of the, whether we're coming out of the pandemic or it's abated somewhat, but the negative impact that the pandemic has had on the economies in general, and the prospect of higher inflation and recession, all are things that we have to put in context when we think about it. So The NGSF is a network of about 114, 15 central banks, financial supervisors that want to accelerate the scaling up of green finance and and therefore have developed recommendations for bankers' roles in climate change. They were formed in 2017. So you're right. There's not a lot of organizations that have a lot of experience. People are working through this. Toronto Centre has, identified greening and climate risk only in 2015, 2016, but you've seen an adoption by many organizations of the need for climate change control. So, what does the NGSF do? So, as a network, they voluntarily exchange experiences, they share best practices, they contribute to the development of environmental and climate risk management in the financial sector, and try to mobilize mainstream support for the transition to a sustainable economy by promoting and defining best practices within their membership. They also hope to influence outside of that group, and they have conducted a good deal of research and going to the NGSF website. That information is publicly available. In addition, they have an independent research network called the International Network for Sustainable Financial Policy Insights, Research and Exchange, and they do some INSPIRE. It's that an acronym, and they are trying to support work for central bankers and supervisors to mobilize a green finance they can. So, developed nations and developing nations are taking different tracks on this. In Africa, there are a number of countries that have taken efforts. Zambia, and we can talk about those later, Ghana. So every country needs to look at this, and supervisors and regulators can be a catalyst, and there is a network to support that activity, the NGSF.
Great, thank you so much, Anatol. And I've also, for everyone on the call, I've shared the link to the NGFS in the chat, and I encourage you to check it out and find out who who your member, if you're a member of that organization. I mean, it's a huge volume of money. We're talking about that, over $2 trillion, and that number of people, 130 million. Going into extreme poverty, potentially by 2030. I mean, when you start to look at those numbers, you start to realize how big this is and how important this is to make moves rapidly, but sustainably. It is not something we can continue to wait about before. We should definitely be having these conversations and taking the right actions, but trying to find the right actions and manage this is something we're new and what we're trying to figure out. So I know that the BCBS of the BIS recently published the principles for the effective management and supervision of climate-related financial risks, which were designed such that they can be adapted to a diverse range of contexts proportionately. And that's the thing, right? We can't just have something that works for all. As you said, each country, each continent are doing slightly different things and have different risks and different ways of doing things contextually, legally. Anatol, maybe you can share with us your thoughts on what the key prudential risks that climate change poses to the financial system.
Well, thanks for that question, Sarah. And you're right. Climate change risks extend to all sectors of the economy. Everybody needs to adapt to this, and climate change and greening will bring new opportunities, but new opportunities create risks. And so for financial services supervisors, we have to be, you need to be prepared to address these risks, that over the horizon view of risk. But these are not emerging risks. These are risks that are emerged, and so standard setters like the BIS are working to deal with this. And it has sort of the nature of risks have been identified, and there are many documents that talk about the nature of the prudential risks that are out there. So physical climate risk is the longer term changes in climate. This is a chronic risk, and the frequency and severity of extreme weather. These are acute risks that can cause damage to assets, property, changes of income, and changes to the affordability and the availability of insurance. So not only are the risks to the insured or the assets of financial institutions and the assets of entities over which bankers and insurance regulators have oversight, but they're affecting individuals. And they have these same risks are there to impact the institutions, the financial institutions. When a hurricane strikes, think about Hurricane Sandy in New York. When it hit downtown Manhattan, all the financial institutions that are located there were equally impacted. And at some point, the risk that the supervisor's own infrastructure will be affected is there as well. So these are overwhelming risks for every component of the economy, the individuals, the institutions, and the oversight. The other one is transition risk, which is the risk related to changes in domestic and international policy and regulatory settings, technology innovation, social adaptation, and market change that can result in changes to costs, income, and profits related to asset viability. So climate change can give also rise to liability risks that have implications for businesses and directors. This is the liability that stems from potential litigation where institutions and boards may not have adequately considered the response to climate change and the impact to investors or others. So those would physical, transition, and liability risks are the key risks, and they cross all sectors. So standard setting bodies like the BIS are looking to have consistent approaches to supervision of climate related risks. And the idea that the paper that the BIS put out is part of their holistic approach under the umbrella of the Financial Stability Board to address climate related risks on the global banking system and to improve bank risk management. But not only banks, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors has partnered with the United Nations convened Sustainable Insurance Forum to publish an application paper on the supervision of climate risks in the insurance sector. And they too are looking to provide information to regulators to address the risks to the insurance sector, set out recommendations and examples of good practices that are consistent with the insurance core principles. Again, they're under the umbrella of the Financial Stability Board. And finally, the International Organization of Securities Commissions has a sustainable finance task force that's seeking to improve consistency, comparability, and reliability of sustainability reporting. The Task Force for Climate Disclosure is an important standard set by the industry themselves for how to disclose those related risks. So the Sustainable Finance and the Role of Securities Regulators is a paper that the Sustainable Task Force has published. And that's an important reference point for those of you who are securities regulators to understand. So at the end of the day, many prudential authorities like the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in Canada, Bank Negara in Malaysia, are all also preparing their own principles and industry guidelines. So there is a wealth of activity going on and information, but it also creates a challenge of information overload on how to manage these. So there's no shortage of support for supervisors and regulators who want to help deal with climate-related risks.
Thank you, Anatol. That's a lot more out there than I perhaps thought there would have been. And I see that Nawazi is helpfully sharing some of those links in the chat for those of you that are interested in following through and reading some of those papers that you spoke about there, Anatol. So, I mean, you know, I like that, you know, we're beginning to see more standards and more principles of how we can do this that really help guide and shape you know, how we can move forward so that we can learn from each other or learn from what's happening elsewhere and not start this with a blank piece of paper, because that's actually quite a challenging place to be. You know, and I'd also like the fact that you brought out there that, you know, these are not risks that may happen. You know, we're not looking forward, we're actually living with many of these risks. I mean, I think probably everyone on this call would either have been involved in extreme weather or have their, you know, neighboring countries involved in that kind of extreme weather that we have been seeing. So I think it's a really good reminder to us that the risks are not necessarily all new, that they're actually happening and will, you know, in some ways, you know, not stop happening, will continue to get worse. So Nick, I want to bring you into the conversation at this point. So Anatol's given us a really nice overview of what the NGFS is, and some of the standards and, you know, some of the principles that are being developed and what's out there that can support everyone on this call. But, you know, there's one work stream that the NGFS has got going right now, which is their net zero for central banks work stream. And, you know, I mean, we talked about what is green finance, and we had Anatol tell us about that. You know, we read a lot about net zero, but net zero for central banks, what does that mean? Can you tell us more?
Sure, yeah, happily. So, I mean, net zero, let's start with net zero, and then we'll talk about net zero for central banks. So net zero as a term refers to the target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions that cause global warming to zero by balancing the amount that's released into the atmosphere from various sources with the amount that's removed and stored by what are called carbon sinks. And carbon sinks can be anything natural or otherwise that accumulates and stores carbon. So this balance of getting the amount that we produce and release with the amount that is collected and stored into balance and to zero is what we think of as net zero. It's also referred to as carbon neutrality, sometimes referred to as climate neutrality. And I think that the important thing there is because of the linkage between the production of greenhouse gases and the impact on the climate, sometimes these terms become a little bit interchangeable: net zero, carbon neutral, climate neutral. And ultimately, this is about focusing on reducing the intensity, likelihood, severity of extreme climate events, and to try and reduce global warming or restrict the increase in global warming. About 130 countries now globally have set or are considering setting some sort of target around reducing net emissions to zero by 2050. About a half of those have got some sort of pledge in law or policy, but as Anatol and Sarah, you've mentioned already, very few have made much progress yet on getting towards those targets. So it's still an early stage of the game for most countries. There are a few countries actually that have already done better than net zero. So there are a few that are carbon negative already. They tend to be very small countries, and they tend to be countries that are deeply forested. But there's about 1.5 million people in the world currently who live in carbon negative countries. So it's about 1/5,000th of the globe. So we've got a long way to go. So that's net zero. And then we have this concept of net zero central banking. And as Anatol has mentioned, there are many banks and investors who are committing to align their portfolios with net zero. We see asset managers with maybe 30 or 40 trillion in assets, and banks with about a further 15 to 20 trillion that have expressed desires to rebalance their portfolios in pursuit of net zero ambitions. And these commitments and these intentions by the financial sector have probably both necessitate and accelerated the need for a kind of strategic response by central banks and supervisors. And as Anatol mentioned, central banks can act as a catalyst. So markets respond to and act on the basis of signals and guidance from central banks. So we're starting to see that central banks and policymakers and regulators as guardians of the financial system, are now exploring how they can support this net zero transition. Anatol's mentioned this already, but two really obvious reasons why regulators and financial authorities are taking this stance and they're trying to support the progress towards net zero. First is basically the understanding that minimizing the risks of climate change are crucial to the stability of the financial system and the macroeconomy. And then secondly, there is such a groundswell of government policy and indeed societal appetite for a greener, more sustainable, safer future that central banks and supervisors are also compelled to adopt positions of alignment and coherence with their government policy and with their societal expectations. So it's good for the economy, it's good for macro financial stability, and it accords with and aligns with what is expected of central banks and governments at the moment. And Sarah, so you mentioned the Network for Greening the Financial System has a new work stream called Net Zero for Central Banks. It was set up just a few months ago, I think back in March or April, initially with a 2-year kind of time horizon. And it's chaired by Bank of Italia and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and looks at kind of 3 components of net zero central banking, but doesn't look at all of the components of net zero central banking. So maybe we'll look at some of the others after this initial kind of overview. But the 3 that the NGFS workstream is looking at is firstly around how central banks can adopt a more sustainable and responsible approach to their own investments. So looking at the portfolios of those central banks and the investments that they hold, trying to align those with a portfolio that is more commensurate with a transition to net zero and supporting that transition. So that will involve things like banks thinking about the kind of bonds that they hold on their investment portfolio, but also will in time involve how central banks think about providing access and liquidity to central bank balance sheets and whether they are contingent on certain net zero alignments and commitments. So the first bit's really looking at kind of sustainable and responsible investment by central banks. The second builds on what we've heard about already from Anatol around disclosure. And as has been articulated, increasingly there are expectations and indeed voluntary movements among the private sector to disclose climate credentials, climate risks, and to articulate how institutions are seeking to move forward in alignment with a net zero strategy. And so the second work stream that NGFS is looking at is around central banks' own disclosure of the climate related and environmental risks that they are exposed to and that they are involved in. And then the third is kind of deals more with the central bank's own corporate operations. So looking at the carbon footprint or the direct carbon footprint of the central bank's activities. And we have various different ways in which institutions are looking at that. Some are very direct emissions. So, what are the emissions from your buildings? What are the emissions from the vehicles that you own and run? Some of them are a little bit less direct. So looking at, what is the energy mix that you're consuming? Is that coming from renewable sources? Is that coming from fossil fuels? Where you're using external data centers, how are they powered? And then some institutions go further and look further through the value chain at, what was the construction methodology for that data center? What were the resources that were brought to bear to build the premises of the central bank? So looking further and further back through the value chain, but effectively trying to come up with a way of measuring the carbon footprint of these institutions and for the central bank to pursue a strategy to reduce that over time. Maybe just on the second one, just go back to that briefly, this piece around environmental risks. The NGFS recognises that in order for substantial progress to be made, coherence and consistency internationally is going to be really, really important. So this bit about disclosing central banks' own climate-related risks, the work stream is going to look at how do we get maximum kind of harmonised, consistent disclosure that is meaningful and comparable between different central banks. That's the sort of focus for that work stream. So they're the 3 bits that it's looking at: sustainable investment, central bank disclosure of risk, and then greening, if you like, of the central bank's corporate operations.
So much, Nick. It's really interesting. It's easy to just think about 1 or 2 of those pieces. It's actually quite a complex jigsaw puzzle looking at the different angles of it. It wasn't until our conversation the other day that I started thinking about actually how, the building and the staff moving around in vehicles and, needing air conditioning for data servers and, some of those, as you said, like, going back as far as, how the buildings was constructed, those weren't things that immediately came to mind, but, actually thinking about the day-to-day operations, of the central bank or, whichever body that we're talking about. But that was something that I hadn't really thought of. So I'm really glad that you kind of brought up the different aspects or some of the key aspects that we need to think about when it comes to, understanding, the different, I suppose, the different actions that people can take. And, I'm just wondering, what would you say, what are the practical steps that central banks can take that will help them minimize their carbon, footprint and contribute to that kind of net zero that we've been talking about?
I mean, so I'd probably separate this answer into two. I think there are some tried and tested and very evident steps an institution can take to manage its own carbon footprint in terms of its sourcing of its energy mix, in terms of thinking about the insulation of its premises, in terms of thinking about how far and on what kind of method it uses to travel, if it does travel, in terms of thinking about its supplier mix, and in terms of thinking about where things like its resources, like food for its employees, come from, like what kind of distance have they traveled. So there's some very simple, practical, tried and tested steps that institutions, central banks and others have taken across the globe to measure their carbon footprint and then make more progressive steps to reduce it. I think the more challenging thing for central banks is the kind of macro architecture for net zero and their explicit and important role in enabling that for the economy. So I'm going to spend more time on that, I think, if I may, today. And what I would say is others have thought about this far more than I. So in terms of kind of recommending some papers to read, there's a really good piece by the London School of Economics with the Grantham Research Institute and the University of London, paper released last year entitled Net Zero Central Banking. Well worth the read, but I'm just going to kind of summarize the 7 kind of core recommendations of that paper, just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that central banks are being encouraged to think about. So unsurprisingly, the first thing really is to have a strategy for this. So that, this is a big problem. There are short-term things that need to be done, and maybe some of the things I just mentioned, Sarah, about how you green your own footprint, maybe they fit into the relatively easy short-term measures. And then there are the need to set longer term expectations, both for the market and for the economy at large, and to provide sufficient clarity and directions so that private and institutional capital can be mobilized effectively. So there is a need, frankly, for an articulated strategy and a roadmap of how the central bank is going to approach net zero at large. And you see these, the Philippines Central Bank has released its sustainable finance roadmap. Various other central banks around the world have done similar things. So an articulated strategy for how they're going to tackle this. That's kind of the first step. Importantly, within those strategies, what you see a lot of central banks recognizing is the need for liaison and coordination between central banks, supervisors, and policymakers. And I'll give you one example. If we think of the housing market, a path to net zero for the housing market may include both changes to things like building regulations around how houses are built, the materials that are used, the construction methodology, may include some kind of public financial support in certain markets to enable people to transition their own housing stock to more net zero compliant buildings. So maybe that's like investment in insulation or the provision of more net zero public utilities and infrastructure. So there's going to be a need for kind of public financial support alongside this change in, say, building regulations, as well as then changes to how prudential supervisors look at mortgage providers. So you can see just in the housing market, for example, there's a need for public policy, government, supervisory, legislative alignment and cohesion. And so a really important part of the strategy is recognizing that need for coordination. Anatol's already spoken about kind of the second main limb a little bit already, which is around kind of prudential regulation. So prudential supervisors making net zero a core element of their supervisory practice, both at the micro individual firm level and at the macro prudential level. and being clear with institutions that that central banks expect net zero transition plans to be part of their corporate governance and business planning, and that they expect institutions to be both identifying and seeking to address as well as they can the individual climate and other risks that they face. So we've seen this in various markets. Anatol's mentioned a couple already. The Central Bank of Kenya has released guidance on climate-related risk management for commercial banks. Indonesia has a regulation on sustainable finance that includes various bits around prudential regulation. And so this is a space where you see quite a lot of activity already by central banks. The third area is around scenarios. So lots of central banks run scenarios and stress tests and various other ways of testing the long-term viability and sustainability and safety of their financial markets. And so increasingly, regulators and central banks are having to include extreme climate events and indeed predictable and likely extreme climate events. These are not remote climate events. These are extreme and likely. These are having to be built into the models and are being, and firms are therefore being required to undertake stress tests against these significant external acts and events that will impact their balance sheet in various different ways. So South Africa, for instance, their Reserve Bank has included physical and transition risk from climate change in its systemic risk assessment of banks. So the third area is around scenarios. The fourth is probably one of the biggest, and I'm just going to give a really high level overview of this because there's so much in this content, but around monetary policy. So central banks having to adequately account for the impacts of climate change on macroeconomic situations and outcomes. So climate change, and again, Anatol mentioned this, but I'll reiterate, it's a really important point. Climate change can have an influence on many, many key macroeconomic variables, including output, consumption, investment, productivity, employment, wages, trade, exchange rates, inflation. It can impact all of these important macroeconomic variables. And so when central banks are trying to fine-tune monetary policy, they clearly have to be considerate of how climate change is going to impact the macroeconomic environment very, very substantially. And maybe it's worth just saying, not all of the climate impacts or net zero impacts will necessarily be negative. So there is also the recognition that, for instance, significant expansion in renewable energy could have material deflationary effects on some economies. So that it could drive down the cost of energy in certain economies quite significantly, and that could depress prices at large across an economy. So it's not just about the kind of the inflationary pressure, it could go the other way as well. There's a whole section, and I'll just give a nod to this and encourage us to look at it. There's a whole section in the report that I mentioned around whether or not climate change and net zero should challenge the traditional market neutrality position of central banks. And effectively, the position is that the pre-existing market neutrality position has led to the status quo that we find ourselves in today, which is a highly carbon intensive economy. And so, as well as thinking about kind of the impacts of climate change on monetary policy, there is a space for central banks to think about, should we be, through our monetary policy, more directive about the kind of assets and investments that are allowable within the economy or encouraged within the economy? Because if we just take a fully neutral position on this, we will persist our status quo high carbon reality that we find ourselves in today. So there's a really interesting kind of policy piece there around how regulators and central banks intervene in markets. And that will present some very complex questions for central banks around, you know, who they provide access to for liquidity purposes, how you access central bank balance sheets when you need it, who can access it, and whether they'll start to put in place some restrictions to say you can only access our liquidity in the event that you are not, you know, contributing to a negative carbon future, you know, a non-positive carbon future. The next piece beyond monetary policy is around portfolio management. So I spoke briefly about that. So that's thinking about the assets that central banks hold themselves. And you are seeing some central banks already taking quite strong positions on this. So Banque de France has excluded investments relating to coal mining companies from its own investments. So it will no longer invest in coal mining companies. Sweden Central Bank did something similar, excluding bonds from Western Australia and Queensland, which are both very kind of fossil fuel heavy regions in Australia. And indeed Alberta in Canada, which is an oil rich or an oil dependent economy. So Sweden Central Bank no longer invests in bonds from those regions because of their high greenhouse gas emissions. You're already starting to see central banks kind of flexing their muscle, I guess. And then I guess the final thing I was going to mention, and we've touched on this a bit, again, highlighted really strongly in this report, is the importance of international cooperation. So a strategy for net zero, yes, has to think about your own local reality and your own domestic requirements, domestic economy, domestic macroprudential situation, but also needs to join up with, interlink with international partners, peers, standard setters, and the like. And in particular, I think things like the multilateral development banks, the likes of the IMF, the World Bank, will have a really important role going forward in both kind of supporting particularly emerging market regulators and economies to develop policy frameworks and activities that are in line with net zero. But then at the same time, the World Bank and the IMF will also have to mainstream net zero in their own operations. They've got to do all the cleaning up of their own shop whilst kind of trying to enable others to do the same. So a big tick for the need for international cooperation and alignment on these topics. So yeah, I just reference it again. It's an LSE paper called Net Zero Central Banking. It's really worth a read. It's very thorough analysis of some of the steps and activities that central banks will need to be involved in the years ahead.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. And I think Nawazi and Septule shared some links in the chat for people to go ahead and find that paper that you referred to. And there's so many things in what you just said, and I'm going to try and unpick and sort of delve deep, because we've already gone through half of our time together. We can't, as you say, can't talk about every single element of it, but there's definitely a few that I kind of want to pick up and pull in and Anatol, I'm going to loop you back into the conversation here, because I think we've also got a question that's coming from Oluwasolo, and I think it sort of links to my other thoughts. So, we've talked about central banks, but obviously we need to sort of think about the wider financial ecosystem. And so the question that's come in from Oluwasolo is, what are specific financial products or activities or services that are green? And the other question to follow, I think, that on with is what changes do we need to see in the greater financial ecosystem? Maybe we'll start there, Anatol, and then I'll delve in with some deeper ones after that.
So I don't think that there's outside of investments and activities that are in sustainable businesses or the development of products, the idea that green finance is supporting all economic activity to be sustainable. So I think that we shouldn't try to find a product. We should say the world needs to look at its economic output differently. Green is a lens on doing all those economic activities differently, and that individuals, businesses, and governments and regulators in particular can contribute to those outcomes. And Nick cited the Swedish Riksbank changes to their holdings, divesting from less clean activity. These are activities that are taking place incrementally. There is certainly a view that the financial sector did not do its part to come to the threat of climate change quickly. That there perhaps is a lack of, people are saying, well, where's the data? This was a long-standing, cry as scientists were alerting us to climate change, where's the data? Where's the data? So we shouldn't be hung up on getting the data. It is now about the actions, and so both the private and the public sector can operate. And what is important is that money goes where it will be treated well and safe. And so supervisors and regulators can create an environment around their financial system that supports the inflow of green finance activities. By having good, solid, stable, macro environments, by ensuring that financial institutions and other institutions are well governed. We can avoid the issue of greenwashing, which is the highlighting of the benefits and less so of alerting to the risks. Regulators, securities regulators, even those, and I think Nick mentioned it, that as central bankers and insurance supervisors conduct their reviews, they need to make looking at what are those sustainability components in the financial institutions' own policies, and of course there are their own sustainable activities. The focus has to shift, and we can play a role by ensuring that the marketplace is stable, there is good governance, and that will encourage more entrepreneurialism, more investment of green finance, and that will have a cumulative effect of bringing those things to bear. Hopefully that answered your question to some degree.
Thank you so much, Anatol. I think it's a difficult, a difficult one, but I guess we've got a captive audience of regulators and supervisors on the call with us. How can they really, stimulate and drive this global change? What is there, how can you sort of motivate or inspire or encourage people to bring that transformation?
Well, let me start, and Nick probably can sound into this. Of course, these start with policy decisions, but there's a boldness and that regulators and supervisors need to have, and to follow a path that is perhaps unconventional. Instead of asking me that question, let Nick have a comment, but let's turn it around to the audience and say, what are they doing? Because this is, I'm looking at it from a perspective of an outsider. And we know that there are many agencies and authorities that are doing that work, but of those that are here, what are their authorities doing? Well, let's bring the audience into the conversation.
Great idea. If anybody's got anything they want to share, raise your hand or pop in the chat, and then I can come to you. In the interim, while the participants are thinking, Nick, have you got anything to add to that?
I think as Anatol said, I think it's recognizing that policy and frameworks are what enable markets to move on at scale. And so regulators and central banks are going to have to provide some clarity and some direction to overcome the inertia that will persist otherwise. I think there's also a need to recognize that I was at a conference recently, and the penny hadn't really dropped to me on this, but one of the speakers was saying that there is so much to be done. There is so much to be invested in, that thinking that public capital and taxpayers alone will have the balance sheet depth to do this is ridiculous. It's going to dwarf the balance sheets of the public sector and taxpayers. And so institutional and private capital will have to be mobilized at scale. And institutional and private capital, a lot of it is locked up in very low risk funds and managed very carefully by custodians who are protecting those assets for long-term wealth. And those asset managers are not going to devote this capital to this important initiative unless they understand the rules of the game, unless they understand how regulators are thinking about it, and unless they are, if not incentivized, certainly enabled to put people's money at risk at scale over a long period of time. So I think it's really helpful for central banks to recognise that they have a really crucial role in mobilising private capital. And the best way to do that is through enabling policy frameworks and also by leading by example. I think, you know, we should recognise regulators cast a very long shadow, and that can be a really positive shadow, or it can be the opposite. And I think by regulating central banks starting to measure their own climate footprints, by them starting to progressively look at how they clean up their own operations, by them taking positions on things that are completely out of kilter with a net zero future and being bold and prepared to express that, I think that starts to signal and shape the way in which the market will move. So I guess that they would be some of my thoughts, but I'd love to hear what some of the folks in the call are doing.
Yeah, we haven't got any hands up yet. You know, that was very insightful, Nick, and it sort of reminded me that the Financial Stability Board has a climate roadmap that supervisors can leverage. So if people are looking for a starting point, the NGSF is another one, is a good one. But and what the FSB does that is also helpful is that it has its regional committees, and climate change is consistently a topic in those regional committee meetings, and agencies can go in and look at the notes from those meetings and see what's happening, you know, globally, but as well within their regions, and identify partners, regulatory partners that they may be able to work with to capitalize on those things. But you said it really well. You know, it's the policy and the frameworking that needs to be in place.
I guess the other thing I would add is, Anatol mentioned this briefly earlier, but maybe I'll just draw it out just to draw a bit more attention to it. There is the investment that needs to happen in what are kind of natively green solutions, so renewable energy and things like that, where we're building new infrastructure that is more, let's say, carbon aligned and net zero aligned than historic production. But actually the bigger piece is the transition. The far, far bigger piece that needs investment is the transition from what we might think of as brown industries to green industries. And increasingly, I think there is kind of global recognition that for specific sectors and industries within the economy, there is a need for sectoral pathways that explain how certain, whether it be transportation, but then even within transportation, what is the greening pathway for shipping? What is the greening pathway for long distance shipping versus what is the greening pathway for localized shipping? So there's this real need for specificity. And I guess the reason I'm flagging that is two things. One, it's really easy to see a true green bond that frankly is like investing in a new solar power plant. Like regulators haven't got a massive job really to kind of create regimes around that, except the greenwashing problem that Anatol has highlighted. But where it is investment in net green, I think that's the easy bit. The hard bit is how do you mobilize massive amounts of capital to the transition journey? And I guess my recommendation to those on the call is there is no way that within central banks they have all of the intellectual capital they need to know how to solve those issues at a sectoral level. So the final kind of call to action really is this need for massive public-private collaboration. There is a need to kind of bring together the intellectual capital of the private sector and the public sector to articulate what these sectoral pathways will look like so that the investment from brown to green can be undertaken at the scale it needs to be.
And you've mentioned that a couple of times about the need to bring private capital into this discussion. And I was reading recently that the African Development Bank said that in order to have Africa comply with the Paris Agreement, it's going to take $3 trillion by 2030, and 75% of that will have to come from the private sector. So that's a huge amount. I can't do the math offhand, but it's a lot of money. And so creating, I think you're really bang on when you talk about the transition risk being brown to green, as opposed to start fresh or evergreen activities.
So we're hearing, or what I'm hearing here is that there's some more straightforward things that central banks can start to do. I like the idea, Nick, very much of what you were saying, was being a role model. If looking at, can we put in or use solar or wind or a cleaner source of energy to run our office, for example, being, one of those things, just giving an example off the top of my head. But, that simple thing of showing the way, we are changing our ways to act in a more green, sustainable way. And obviously, of course, you would expect what happens to happen from, regulators and supervisors is that, the policy and the frameworks, right? That is the core of the job. So we would expect that to happen. But I think, it's really interesting to sort of see and unpick there, there's sort of some easy wins, which, as you talked about, going after, things that are already green, relatively easy to find, but those, difficulties being those transition areas, which requires so much investment. And from both of you, I'm hearing, we are going to need that public-private, collaboration. There's no doubt about that, to be able to sort of to both financially, but also figure out the way forward, right? If there was an easy answer to some of these problems, we wouldn't be where we are now. They're quite challenging to figure out, how we can move forward and and change, otherwise, if it didn't need money and significant thought, one would probably say we would already be there, be there already.
Well, perhaps, Sarah, I can just comment on that, because it's not that there are easy answers, but there are answers and models that have been in place. So if we go back, and this audience will probably appreciate the issues about financial inclusion and women's banking, and trying to deal with proportionality, bankers and regulators can take that same approach and put it to green banking. So that these are banks that are focused on carbon neutral or blended finance arrangements. And so thinking about a secure and stable, sound and stable environments around green, and banks, and if you think about the banking environment in each country, then they can have country-driven, nationally based financial solutions that are designed to support the private investment in that country, and as well to encourage and support the inflow of aid money in that context, or private investment from other sources. So I think that again, it is a bit of a policy shift, but it's a model that already has existed, and we need to just change the focus and the approach to be green.
Thanks for that, Anatol. That's really interesting to put it. I guess, I think you said, or I'm not sure if it was Nick, yourself, or both of you, but that it's a gender, like we have a gender lens on a lot of the work that we do. We also now need to put that kind of green, financing lens on, and thinking about that from all different angles when we're coming up with policy frameworks, etc. I want to pick up on another thing that you said, Nick, because I thought it was really interesting. You talked about many central banks have that market neutrality position, and whether that needs to shift. And one particular area that I'm sure many of us have read about that is quite controversial now, where we sort of think about green and its impact on the environment, is Bitcoin mining. We know that takes a huge volume of energy. So my question is, should technologies, for example, the use of certain technologies, is that one area that regulators, can take a different stance on, not being, neutral, but actually sort of making some stance that is perhaps more, congruent with being green?
Yeah, so I've been slightly outspoken as a regulator on this topic for a while, even before Bitcoin mining. I find the technology neutral stance incongruent with the technology dominated financial market that we have today. maybe though, in fairness, maybe I'll briefly articulate what the perceived benefits of technology neutrality are, and then maybe I'll give you a view of some of the downsides of that, and then how that perhaps applies to Bitcoin. So I mean, fundamentally, I think most regulators and governments around the world have varied principles or policies of technology neutrality. I think part of the intention is to try and future-proof regulation, so to not have to change the regulation every time a new technological innovation comes onto the scene. And I think the hope and belief is that this tech-neutral approach allows regulation and statutory legislation to persist for longer. I think partly the intention is to articulate regulation and law that's non-discriminatory and facilitates and derives the benefits of competition. I think that's part of it as well, this desire not to impede or impose or in some way influence competition. I think in some cases, technology neutrality is also convenient for policymakers and regulators in that it allows regulators not to have to fully understand the technology in order to express a regulatory stance on a given issue. And I think the intention is to, as I say, kind of allow for innovation and future development through a regulatory system or legal structure that enables some flexibility and freedom to choose and competing products to come to market. There are some downsides, as I see it, though, of technology neutrality as a regulatory position. And maybe I'll just be really clear for a moment. I think regulators should be vendor neutral. I don't think they should pick commercial winners or organizational winners in a competitive market. But I personally don't think they should be technology neutral. I think neutrality, when written into law, generally ends up in a sort of beautifully ambiguous position. So there's this, when regulators write technology neutral law, they kind of persist uncertainty and ambiguity. And the net effect of that in most changing markets is that it slows down progress and it slows down adoption of new technologies. And I think at the moment, with the kind of challenges the globe faces, we need to be embracing, not all, and we'll come back to Bitcoin, we need to be embracing new technological solutions to the problems that we have developed for ourselves over the past several decades. So I think part of the problem is that technology neutrality results in ambiguity. Partly it persists status quo bias, partly because of that ambiguity, but also laws written without the ability to consider or predict future tech will always be grounded in today's tech. No matter how neutral we try to be, we will frame our legal drafting around what we know today. So basically what we do by doing that is reinforce today's technology for longer than we might otherwise do. So that's the other downside as I see it. And so I think we assume technology neutral laws are more future proof. I don't personally believe that they are. I think the other downside is that because they're ambiguous, they inject waste into the financial system because there's a lot of legal costs through interpretation. Regulators tend to leave it to the courts to legislate on how technology fits within specific laws and regulations. So that just drives a lot of legal cost into the system, and it drives additional delay into the system, and that reduces productivity. And then I think the other thing, and maybe this is where Bitcoin starts to become particularly relevant, is if we remain entirely neutral, we will also facilitate the emergence and growth of technologies and solutions that perhaps don't accord with societal norms or expectations. The most obvious example is probably around kind of privacy and information security. Like if we are entirely neutral about that, we will allow fairly dubious behavior and uses of technology that breach privacy. But I think Bitcoin's a great example where perhaps unencumbered, we might create technologies that have certain value in society, but have very significant downsides when it comes to things like their alignment with net zero. And then finally, I said regulators perhaps go for tech neutrality because it means they don't have to dive deep and understand the technology. And I think that's not a great position in the medium term. I think regulatory unpreparedness and insufficient understanding of the risks and benefits of new technologies both results in them potentially missing the harms that those technologies could present to consumers and markets, also results in under leveraging the opportunities of new technologies, be it for things like regulatory compliance, and in time will restrict regulators' own adoption of modern technologies to improve the way they execute on their responsibilities. So I think there's definitely an upside in greater understanding and awareness, and in order to write policy that is more technology informed, regulators have to be more informed themselves. So I think if we go back to this kind of maximalist example of net zero central banking, in order that central banks and regulators can support and guide and catalyze a transition to a net zero economy, they will have to have an understanding, in my opinion, of which technologies are net contributors to that vision and which are detrimental to that pursuit. A more informed regulator can help shape financial market. As we said already, markets respond positively to signals and clarity from central banks. And in my opinion, a highly carbon intensive, energy consuming, precious metal wasting cryptocurrency is perhaps not in keeping with pursuit of net zero. And in my opinion, I think regulators and central banks should be far more vocal about whether or not such methods and technologies are acceptable and consistent with that kind of sustainable path that they want to go on. I am not like an anti-crypto guy. Like, I've spent years looking at various cryptocurrencies. I think the underlying technology of many of the original cryptocurrencies are fascinating. I actually think blockchain will be a massive accelerant of our transition to green, as it will empower the connection of IoT devices and sensors and satellite technology and all sorts of things. It will enable sharing of information in new ways and far more efficient ways. But I think Bitcoin, due to the way it executes its consensus mechanism, is about as far out of line with the net zero vision as one could conceive of in the technology world today. Just my opinion, though. I don't work for a regulator anymore, so I can say
it. Well, thank you for being frank and honest and sharing your opinion with us. And it's always brave to say something, out loud in an environment. But I think it's, interesting, like when we talk about like being neutral, as you say, it's not necessarily about pushing a particular vendor or even a particular technology. It's about saying we're going to say no to any technology, or anything that has an impact, a negative impact on the environment. It has a high carbon footprint. It's not that we're not expecting sort of certain positions to be taken against certain vendors, or again you're saying there's nothing wrong with blockchain, but actually the way Bitcoin mining has been set up is actually the issue. They're not cryptocurrency generally, and I think that's really important that we hear that message, that it's not about that taking a stance actually is possibly also the only way to drive change.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think it's probably worth putting it in context a little bit. A single Bitcoin transaction has the same carbon footprint as a return flight from London to Dallas. Put another way, a single Bitcoin transaction has the same carbon footprint as nearly 2 million Visa transactions. So this is not, I know a lot of people, the Bitcoin maximalists, will say, well, there's other more polluting things in this world, but given the scale at which Bitcoin operates, the amount of carbon it produces, the amount of energy it wastes is just unbelievable. And I hadn't realized it. I don't think you often see it in those terms. You see it compared to the energy consumption of Argentina. And unless you live in Argentina, you don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
I think like one transaction, the same carbon footprint as a return flight from London to Dallas, that really hit home for me. That feels like a lot of carbon dioxide from a single transaction.
And I think it's really interesting. Both of you mentioned the term, greenwashing, and I think that's when we sort of, sometimes it can be very easy to try and mask what's going on, or to put a front forward. Like, I mean, I've noticed even just generally consumerism, right? Many bottles of things, drink, food, products that you're buying suddenly now have photos of leaves on it, or have gone green in color, right? Some basic examples of greenwashing, but actually trying to really compare one thing against another, like you did, Bitcoin, one Bitcoin mine versus number of Visa transactions, that actually stops the ability to be able to do some of this greenwashing by actually sort of trying to compare similar things and share information. Anatol, let me bring you in there, but how do we try and help stop greenwashing in the financial sector?
Well, actually, I think Arashaful Alam's got a comment that sort of talks to that. We're talking to financial services regulators in isolation, and it is, a economy, socioeconomic issue that has to be addressed. But we can only influence the conversation here amongst ourselves. But at the end of the day, and this goes back to one of the first things Nick was saying in response to your question, the role of regulators, central banks, if they have a market development mandate, they can take a green view, and they can set that the standards like the Task Force for Climate Financial Climate Disclosure obligations. And the IOSCO standards about having a common global standard for disclosure that is adopted by all securities regulators, that is consistent with the work of insurance and banking regulators, so that people know the rules. And that phrase has come out more than once. And just like advertising standards had to be brought in the early days of television marketing because people could say anything. We go back to cigarette advertising. They advertise the lifestyle, not the consequences. These are the kind of things that will have to flow through. And again, I go back to saying these they're not necessarily easy, but it's not like they haven't been done before. And we have to learn from our history and apply those things so that we can accelerate the adoption of regulatory changes, the implementation of standards, deal with the naysayers. Regulators, and why, going back to Ashraful's point, a good financially stable environment is the foundation on which all other activities will occur. If you don't have good financial stability and good financial inclusion, you can't do a lot of these things. So it's a bit of a hand in glove. But that is, in my view, why it is so important for regulators and supervisors to adopt these, because they have a direct on the financial institutions and an indirect on the economy impact that goes beyond, their punching their weight. So that would be my point.
Thank you, Anatol. And there's the very last thing that Ashraful, you put in your comment. We need to create an ecosystem where green should be inevitable. I think that's what we're a great statement that make it so much so that doing something that isn't green, or that is has a high carbon footprint, almost becomes something that we just don't think about doing anymore. We are trying to funnel behavior and choices along a path so that green is inevitable. As I hope we no longer are having conversations about why we should include women. It's about how we should include women, and we move forward down those conversations and the importance of financial inclusion. And we've talked to many about those, and we need to sort of move down to those actions and making concepts of inclusion and green and sustainability just normal things, and not actually having to hopefully have these kind of conversations anymore.
Yeah, and that's why the role of the regulator is important, right? If you think about cars in the early days, seatbelts weren't something that manufacturers automatically put into the car. They were a safety feature that was required by regulators. Drinking and driving, the severity of the laws to change societal behaviors. So it will require regulators and supervisors to be focused. And if you're asking the financial institution in your supervisory activity, what is your, how are you complying with the task force for financial climate disclosure? What is your, how are you managing your carbon footprint? And they have to, those organizations will then have to ask the entities in which they're dealing with. We can't have a cascading effect to that, as you so put it well from Ashaful, that it's an inevitable outcome.
Yeah, I'd just add a couple of thoughts on that, kind of slightly tangential, but I think this idea that green has to become the norm in order for enterprise to survive, I think there's a real role for kind of citizen activism here as well. And I think, we speak about some of the perils of these new technologies, but actually technology has surfaced and elevated and amplified citizen voice in a really powerful way. And so I think there is something about the change that citizens want to see being made to happen by their own activism and their own power, leveraging social media and technology platforms to amplify that voice. And then I think the other point I was going to make was around kind of the younger generation that, increasingly in many markets are somewhat disconnected from investments and capital markets. And yet I think kind of this focus on green and sustainability offers a really strong opportunity to connect, particularly the millennial generation, with finance in a way that they haven't before. So sure, lots of people are using mobile banking and mobile payments, but there hasn't been great participation in capital markets. That millennials do not invest in equities and bond markets in the way that perhaps their parents or their parents' parents do. They've been a bit disconnected from those markets. But a lot of millennials are incredibly passionate and purposeful and mission driven. And this idea that they can play a role in enabling this transition to a sustainable world, I think will actually entice many of them into capital markets. So I think the other issue for regulators, and maybe not central banks, maybe more conduct regulators to think about and consumer protection agencies, is how to safely enable this population that hasn't necessarily been involved in asset management and investment before, how to safely enable them to partake and contribute their capital and their wealth into the system, and to keep them protected, because many of them are suspicious, many of them are worried, many of them are not seeing the upside of being part of this formal financial system. And I think this whole kind of net zero focus gives an opportunity for them to be invited in and included on something they care about, but it's important they're protected as they make that step into the financial system.
I think that's a great point, and we are seeing more choice. I mean, I think about myself. I have a couple of bank accounts, and one of whom I have closed recently because I've been unhappy with seeing that bank's conduct in the space that they're in, and I've made that choice and making actively personal choices to swap everything in my life, right? Not just the products I choose to use, less plastic. There's so many things out there, but it is thinking about who you choose to bank with and who your financial services providers are is something that we are going to see people choosing and making decisions by choice. And I'm really, I think it's really exciting to see that we can bring in this younger generation. But you talked about conduct and market issues there, and I think while we're talking about this, that there are some potentials and some risks there. Are there any others, Nick, out there? Maybe is this something that the older generation would get on board with, or are we going to see some sort of challenges and issues there? Are we going to see some, uptake of, sort of consumer protection issues? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think there could be some other risks and issues. We've spoken a little bit about greenwashing. The logical extension of greenwashing is a scam or a fraud. So in some cases, greenwashing is somewhat benign. In others, it is used as a vehicle to entice participation in a product or service and to abuse that customer and take their money. So I think we are already seeing kind of greenwashed frauds coming onto the market. I think my perspective on scams and frauds is that regulators, you can often predict what the next one's going to be, but regulators often don't come out of the traps until they see it. And so I do wonder if there is something to be said for regulators being a little bit more on the front foot here, saying we know that millions of you are going to be enticed to partake in this green transition. We know trillions of dollars needs to be devoted to this green transition. This is kind of we live in a technology-enabled world. These are like this is the perfect hunting ground for scammers and fraudsters. Beware. So I think there is something about kind of getting ahead of those scams and frauds before they really kind of poison, frankly, society's perception of this green finance revolution that's needed. We've spoken a bit about kind of the prudential risks for financial institutions, but there are then obviously kind of prudential or stability risks for businesses as well. So if we think of the brown polluting industries in our economy, now, are they going to start to see increased costs through carbon offsets or tax regimes? Are they going to find it harder to access investment funding and debt finance? And I think that's why, as we said, it's really important to have these kind of transitional pathways and this way for finance to fund the transition, and not, frankly, to just assume that these polluting industries need to kind of wither and die. Like, this is not going to be practical. If we're approaching it in that way, we'll see mass failure of businesses and mass unemployment and then mass macroeconomic instability. So I think we need to think about like what sectors of the economy are going to struggle to access finance, what are going to start to see diminishing customer numbers. Sarah, you mentioned you voted with your feet when you saw a conduct issue you didn't like. What happens when consumers vote en masse rapidly to ditch a certain industry because they no longer see it as sustainable? So I think we could see some shocks across different parts of the economy, and that will feed through into wages and employment. We've spoken a little bit about the need for kind of effective monitoring and data and information about funds and firms that are targeting green. There's going to be some challenges in how to make transparency and disclosure useful and meaningful. Disclosure is a tried and tested go-to tool for regulators. Disclosure is also a tried and tested and failed mechanism of informing consumers. That we see it in markets again and again and again and again, that disclosure doesn't work brilliantly unless it's really smart disclosure delivered in a really compelling, clear, easy to understand way. So we could quickly dwarf and smother consumers in data because we have so much data nowadays, and we're only going to get more. Making that data meaningful, allowing people to actually turn data into insight, helping people understand how to mediate between contradictory data and therefore make decisions. I think that's going to be a challenge. And then I guess we briefly mentioned this as well, this idea that certain assets and sources of people's wealth will just not be insurable. So let's say you own a small house in a low-lying area that's likely to be at risk of rising sea levels. You may just be priced out of insurance, or you may just not be able to access it at all. And so we'll start to see this kind of idea of stranded assets or assets that are uninsured becoming more of a problem. And I think actually this is an area where the increasingly technological model that we have today might exacerbate this still further, because we are starting to see depooling of risk. So whereas before you could get insurance because you were part of a massive mix of assets that were being insured, you're now starting to see individualistic, customer-centric, customized pricing, which is great if you've got a low-risk asset. It's awful if you have a high-risk asset. So as we start to see depooling enabled by technology and data analytics, we'll also start to see uninsurable assets. And that will leave consumers vulnerable to total loss, and or it will just drive asset prices really low for certain assets. So that will start to reduce wealth and savings, and that will be really important for people's long-term financial situation as they look to transition out of employment into, say, retirement and later life. A lot of people rely on these assets for the wealth that empowers that retirement. So I think we're going to see some challenges around that as well. So yeah, I guess scams, stranded assets, data just drowning people, and then this problem of certain industries no longer being societally acceptable, impacting jobs and wages and people's livelihoods. So it's always negative when you talk just about risks in a specific question.
No, but I think it's really important that we highlight those, because actually, then we know what it is that we're trying to avoid from happening, right? Or to actually sort of, if we look forward and try and sort of put things in place that minimize those risks, it's never, you can never get away with them completely, but if we can try and minimize them, and then we have a better chance of having less of that negative impact hopefully being seen. We have 4 minutes left. I can't believe that the hour and a half is almost up. I would really love just to sort of end with if you were, I'll come to both of you, and Anatol, I'm going to start with you, but if you were sort of going to get the people on this call to go away and maybe action or do 1 or 2 things, or everyone's had a lot of information, what would you advise them to do so that they can go back and continue this conversation in their country?
Well, I think that it was Olawasala put the comment in there that the opinion was that awareness is low in Africa, and that is something that it's not just Africa, it's everywhere, and so these type of engagements are increasing awareness, and it goes down to that individual supervisor awareness, so that when they can influence supervisory activity, regulatory policy, they will be able to bring to bear this kind of understanding. And it's a conversation we have as a group, and it's a conversation we have one-on-one. So if everybody here in this conversation, in this session, shared the conversation with another colleague, or up the chain within their organization, and saying, what are we doing to help with green finance and to deal with climate risk, those conversations will be quite influential. And so, building awareness is just, the starting point.
Thank you, Anatol, and over to you, Nick.
Yeah, I think as everyone recognizes, this is a big journey, and the first step on any big journey is challenging, but we must start walking. So I think if that means taking something you've heard today and just learning a bit more about it and pursuing your own learning journey, most of us are new to this space. So follow your passion, be curious, learn where you can. And then I think Anatol said it really, really well. Like, international and domestic collaboration are going to be absolutely key to solving this issue. We really need to mutualize our learnings. We really should not all be making the same errors as we start to look at how to solve this. We don't really have time to waste on all making the same mistakes. I think it was Einstein that said insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So if someone's tried something and it failed, maybe it was a blip. If 2 people have tried something and it failed, it's probably going to fail the 3rd time. So there's lots out there now that different central banks, standard setters, policymakers, academics are putting out to help people think about this journey, take those learnings, pick up the thing that you think looks easiest to run with first, and just make that first step. The first step will be the thing that then empowers you to take the steps after that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anatol and Nick, for that. Those really, give advice, right? It can feel overwhelming, it can feel huge. But everything, we have to take one small step going forwards, because as we've said, 130 million people will be living in extreme poverty by 2020 if we don't change things. And I think, if we just, for one thing, sometimes it's worth remembering, and having those statistics in our mind just to galvanize us to do something, or just to think slightly differently every time we're in a meeting, or we're asked for an opinion, or we're asked to put something together, or to share views. Just to remember to kind of put that gender lens and that climate lens, like we've got gender lenses, like we've got inclusion lenses, like, put those in our mind, I think is going to be really important. And tomorrow we're going to start unpicking what that gender and, the intersectionality between gender and climate. And then on Thursday, our last call, we will be talking a bit more about that disclosure and data, and digging in a bit more deep as to what that might look like. We are going to share today's session on campus with you with a summary. We'll also include some of the links to the papers that we've talked about and the websites and the groups, such as the NGFS, so that if you didn't catch them during the call, you can go back on campus and pick them up there. Just also a reminder from my side, people can still join, like campus is not closed. So if you really enjoyed today's session and you think your peers and colleagues, in fact, given what Anatol and Nick have both said, invite 2 or 3 people that are sat around you right now or sat next to you in the work to join tomorrow's call. They can sign up and register, and let's start to include more people in the conversation to get this moving forward. Anatol, Nick, thank you very much for spending an hour and a half with us today. It's been really enjoyable.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Enjoyed the discussion.
And we hope we've all of you on the call, thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and comments in the chat, and we look forward to further conversation tomorrow. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Take care.